Hi, Misha here, and let's do another black box. But, the last several I've done have been more just hangout, updates, things of that nature. Well, I started doing these as more of a kind of an opinion piece, an op-ed, if you will, if you want to be old school about it, about whatever topic maybe was on my mind. Done a few on like UFOs, did some on flat earthers, did some on the election and the election results, and that wasn't controversial at all. So let's do it again. In this one, I want to talk about expectations in the firearms community. Obviously, it's something, because it's my profession, that I have direct experience with, although this can be extended to lots of things in life. But this really is just on expectations. Specifically, I want to kind of talk about Kalashnikovs, AK guns, because oh my goodness, some people out there, they literally go over their guns even before they shoot them with a fine-tooth comb. Now, I'm not calling anyone out. In fact, there's, honest to God, no person in my head right now. Just more of a collection of watching how the community goes over the last few years and some of the complaints. Some legitimate, many cosmetic, a few just frankly asinine. Let's talk about AKs in the beginning. And I can't really talk about perception of AKs in the 80s because I wasn't buying them then. Yeah, I was alive. Yeah, I was even going to gun shows with my father. But my experience as an adult begins in the late 90s. Back then, people's expectations of AKs were that they be reliable, extremely durable. Basically, the myth at the time was they never required cleaning. You couldn't break them. And at the same time, people expected them not to be able to hit the broadside of a barn. And they didn't really expect them to look that pretty, attractive. In fact, early on, even though the issue existed, people didn't even really talk about, say, canted sights. And early on, mag wobble wasn't really an issue because these were all standard double stack magwell guns up until 1998 and everything else changing. But there was one other consideration. AKs were cheap. In the late 90s, I'm going to adjust my mic a bit, so sorry for the ruffling. In the late 90s, well, an AR was $800 to $1,000, depending on which one you nabbed. Kind of a Bushmaster type, 800, maybe a Colt, 1,000 or more, whatever. You get the idea. My point is, an AK was $300 to $400, and that was actually up because back in the days of the Chinese guns, the Mac 90s, they were $200 to $300. Either way, they were less than half the price of an AR. Cool. We used to joke for years what a mad world it would be when AKs were more expensive than ARs. We just never thought it would happen. But lo and behold, 20 years later, here we are. I can literally buy a Colt AR for almost half of what an Arsenal AK costs. And with this increased price and a whole new generation, expectations are very different. Canted sights were probably the first issues to become talked about online about 10-15 years ago with the Wasser. And back then, people would talk about them, usually advising people, hey, if you're going to buy one, look it over in the store first. If it looks good, take it home. But it was also kind of known that even if you ended up one with a canted sight, it would be very easy to fix. Just it wasn't perceived as that big of a deal. You know, people realized that really with a hammer you could make it right, and that's kind of the truth. Just give it a good whack sometimes if they weren't off too much, and you would hear kind of a pop, and they would kind of get back in, because sometimes the sights weren't necessarily installed crooked at the factory so much as they got knocked somewhere in transit. Anyway, I digress. I think you see my point. Mag wobble was also a thing, but this was more of a Wasser thing specifically because they were the most common guns to come in with single stack mag wells. That said, most recognize this was a cosmetic issue. Rarely, if ever, did you hear about mag wobble leading to reliability issues. In fact, the reverse is true. In the store, we had more guns come in with too tight mag wells. They kind of pinch the top of a magazine that led to feeding issues more than the reverse. AKs, they like to run kind of loosey-goosey. It's part of the tolerance system. Of course, there's a maximum tolerance allowed. But let's fast forward to headspace and this propensity for people to grab go and no-go gauges, which are very useful if you're doing a build. In fact, they're required. But if you're buying a factory gun, back in the day, guys, no one did that. If you bought a SAR-1 or a Wasser 10, or even one of the Century M70 AB2 builds, whatever, people didn't buy a gun and then throw headspace gauges in there. It just wasn't a thought. And you know how many friends of mine blew themselves up by just grabbing a gun and shooting it? None. That's not to say it's not a bad practice, but I don't know. First off, go and no-go gauges are intended for use when building a gun. Checking a already made gun, that's the job of a field gauge. And it's funny because most people have go and no-go gauges, but not field gauges. But unless you're a builder, if you're just a shooter, it's actually the field gauge that you need. And really, headspace, the traditional way of checking it, you checked it when there was already a problem. If the gun was malfunctioning, if brass was looking deformed, if smoke, gas was escaping in an odd way, then you would check the headspace. Like, okay, it was one of your first diagnostic tools when you already suspected there was an issue because of other symptoms. Going into a perfectly good-looking gun, maybe one you haven't even shot yet, to check headspace is almost inviting trouble, if that makes sense. And on top of that, and I'm not, again, singling any one person out, but there's a right way and a wrong way to check headspace. And of course, it is kind of firearms dependent too. My point is, half the people I think out there using these headspace gauges really haven't received any training as such to use them. I know it sounds stupid, you know, it's just a chunk of metal, but there are various factors. But the truth is, if a gun shoots and cycles and the brass looks fine, why are you worrying about it? The gun is working fine. Even if it fails a no-go gauge, if the gun's working fine, maybe it's a gauge problem, maybe it's a tolerance stacking problem. Keep in mind that not all gauges are made equal. There's different specs, and gauges themselves, just like guns, get worn, and sometimes gauges themselves can be defective too. I'm not saying don't check headspace. Lord, no. I'm saying check headspace if there's already a problem. Next up, rivets. Back in the day, people didn't give two fucks about rivets. As long as they were there and not falling out, it just wasn't an issue. Now you have people trying to slide pieces of paper under them. and thinking that a dimpled rivet is a negative, or that if a rivet is not perfectly crushed, that it's defective. Guys, it's a rivet. It's a hunk of metal that's smashed into place. And the thing is, once you smash it, that's it. There's no like going back to do it again till you get it perfect. So unless it's really, really canted, crooked, cattywacky, any factory is going to go, yeah, good enough and fine. And there and again, it's kind of like with headspace I was saying. If there is other issues, if the gun's not behaving properly, if a trunnion seems loose, if the rivet has play in it, then yeah, you have issues. But guys, going back 10 years ago, you know what was the crazy thing people were doing? Screw builds. Now, of course, that was absolutely wrong. I'm not encouraging screw builds. Yet people did them and shot them. Yeah, I know, it's insane. But if people can get away with using screws, chances are 99% of rivets out there are just gem dandy. And I'm talking all AKs. If you have a factory built AK from somewhere overseas that's been building these for 40, 50, 60 years, I bet you they got it right. I mean, there's always a fluke, there's always a lemon. But chances are, I mean, how often do you hear of a rivet giving way on an AK? Yet again, I'm not saying it can't happen and doesn't happen, but how frequent of an issue is this really? And that kind of leads me to my next point. Lemons. I've said it here, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Everything made by man, hell, every human, every time a mother gives birth to a child, everyone makes lemons. It happens. That doesn't exactly excuse them, but it's just part of the imperfect world we live in. So there's always going to be a bad apple somewhere in the mix. It could be a Palmetto State, it could be a Century, it could be an IO, but it could also be an Arsenal, or it could be an FB Radom, or a WBP, or a Zastava. Hell, it could be an HK, a SIG, a BNT. Every gun maker on the planet has put out a bad gun. Even John Moses Browning probably made a turd now and again. And in the past, they didn't really get publicized a whole lot before the internet. But now with bulletin boards, forums, YouTube, every time there's the one lemon, everyone hears about it. And moreover, often that case gets repeated on multiple message boards, multiple forums, even referenced in multiple YouTube videos. So one seems like it's 10. And then people start worrying, what if mine is like that one? Which, okay, fair enough. But at the same time, you have to recognize that's one gun out of 1,000, or even 10,000. The chances of yours being a bad gun haven't gone up just because one person out there in Idaho or one person over in Vermont happened to get that bad gun. On top of that, just by human nature and the way information is transmitted, you hear so much about the one or two bad guns and never about the hundreds or even thousands of happy gun owners out there. I think the early NPAPs and M92 PVs from Zastava back when Century was importing them in 2013 were major victims of that. Yes, there were some defective guns, but there were also tens of thousands of guns that people had and shot. And for every gun that had issues, you can find people online saying, I've shot 5,000-10,000 rounds through mine. Somehow those reports aren't given the same weight as the negative reports. And that's kind of where we're at. Negatives get more weight, more attention than positive. And you always have to remember, one way or the other, it's a sample size of 1. Now, I'm going to poke a little fun at someone here, but I think he knows who he is, and he knows it's in good fun. Earlier this year, he was kind of fussing over FB Radom Barrel rivets, only based on pictures he saw. Actually obtaining a Barrel, he realized, hey, his rivets are great looking. Are they absolute perfection? No, these are mass-produced guns, but they're perfectly serviceable and fine. And even those quote-unquote bad rivets, the 2 guns or so that people are reporting, keep in mind those are pictures, and photography can sometimes make something look more pronounced, make it look worse than it really is. And even if a rivet looks bad, if it holds the gun together, it's doing its job. Do you think all the rivets on, P-51 Mustangs or Liberty ships looked great? Hell no. They slapped those suckers in. Well, now this guy, he bought a 104 FR, and I think it was half in jest, but he was also worrying about a little nick, a little notch in the bolt of his new, to him, 104 FR. First worrying about it, he quickly realized that, hey, that's just part of an AK. Some might have it more or less, but it's a relief cut that AKs have. Likewise, he was worried about some wear marks on the hammer rivet inside there, the FCG rivet, only to look at other guns and realize that all AKs have wear in that area, some to greater, some to lesser extent, but all have it. So sometimes you don't even know a gun has a quote-unquote problem until you go looking for it. And if you've been shooting a gun happily for 5-10 years, and then you only notice later because of a new gun a certain thing, so what? These are just cosmetics. And that's kind of how Soviet machinery is meant to be. They made them with rather loose tolerances, but they also designed them with relief cuts and angles, much so that the parts could wear in together. So after working in, yeah, they would rub some finish off, burrs and edges might get knocked off, but after, call it a break-in period, and I don't mean break-in as in reliability, I just mean break-in as in the machine working together for itself, it would stop. And it could be 10 rounds, it could be 50, it could be 500. But with most properly built AKs, this will definitely end before the 1,000 round mark. Really, it should end within the first couple of 100 rounds. But sometimes it takes a little more. Either way, that's okay. It's a machine. It's a machine that is made on an assembly line, often put together by hand, and it is a machine designed to control and harness the power of an explosion. So there was going to be some wear and tear in a gun. Any gun you see. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. They are not going to remain mint, perfect things. And that's okay. They're not supposed to. No one ever wanted them to be. I am definitely of the school of thought that guns look good when they have some honest wear and character to them. It shows that they've been there. And what's nice about a gun that has wear on it, they often get very smooth, at least compared to when they were brand new. And at that point, you know a gun's reliable. A gun with 500 or 1,000 rounds in it is probably going to be more reliable than a gun that's had no rounds down the pipe. Just because the parts have had time to wear in, and any small issues or flaws, any small kinks probably have time to get worked out. I remember when I bought my first Glock, it was a 34. And the first 2 mags I shot, it jammed like crazy. And after that, it's never jammed again. It's like it just needed to have about 20 rounds fired through it, and then it has worked perfect for 20 years now. But it was funny because those first couple of mags, it was doing not good. Oh, another 104 FR issue. And it's funny because the 104 FRs aren't new guns. The last ones to come in were like 2015. But people have been talking about the stocks being tight. Of course. In fact, that left side folding stock is made in such a way that it's kind of self-tightening. It's meant to wear into itself, and as it does wear, it bites deeper into the latch, which still gives it rock solid lockup. But you want that. I mean, you don't want a wiggly stock. And you see people sometimes pay hundreds, even thousands of dollars to have custom shops work over the bolt and smooth out the trigger and all this jazz. Frankly, you can get much the same effect for less money, well, before modern ammo prices at any rate, with less money by just shooting it. Guns get quite smooth as they wear in. One final point, kind of going back to the beginning, AKs are expensive now. No if, and, or buts about it. And there's lots of reasons why. Part of it is the exchange rate. The US dollar isn't near as strong as it was 20, 30 years ago overseas. Another part is, for example, the Wasser 1063 being a great example. For a while after the end of communism, these factories were using leftover parts from those communist days, meaning most of the parts were free. All they had to do was make a U.S. compliant receiver, a new barrel, some U.S. compliant furniture, what have you, but their cost was pretty low, so they were able to sell them cheap over here. Likewise, labor costs in places like Romania, while they're not great today, trust me, the average wage in Romania is a lot higher in 2021 than it was in, say, 1995. So there's that to consider. More costs there and everything else. Part of it too is also just the demand. The AK has become popular. It's never really been as popular in America as it is today. It wasn't this popular in the 80s or even 90s. When something's popular, the price gets driven up. And my point here is the AK's more expensive than it used to be for several reasons. But very low on that list of reasons is improved quality. Guess what? Most AKs in 2021 aren't made to a significantly higher standard than those made in the 1980s or 1990s or early 2000s. Just because the customer feels, well, for $1,500 or $2,000, I should get this, to Romanians, that's still the same $300-$400 gun they've always been building. I'm sure they're thrilled that Americans are willing to pay more for it, but they're not building it to a significantly higher standard. I know that a few years ago, Century and Kuger did kind of revamp the Wasser a bit and did kind of improve things marginally. And it's nice, a little more, but we're not talking twice as good. We're talking, 10% nicer maybe, howbeit. And the same thing goes with like WBP or FB in Poland. They do what they can to make a nice gun for America, probably a little more attention to straight sights and fit and finish than they might do for a police contract. But they're not saying, hey, this is a $2,000 gun, we're going to make it better than the $500 gun they used to be. To them, it's the same. So just because American consumers have kind of partially driven up the cost and circumstances have driven up the cost of these AKs, that doesn't necessarily follow that the quality will be quite a bit higher. I hope that makes sense. I would also say it's also because you have more people that were kind of raised on the AR-15, which by and large just has nicer fit and finish than the AK, coming over to the AK. So they're kind of importing their AR-15 standards to the AK. And that's kind of what bugs me, is if you're going to get into AKs, you'll be a lot happier of a collector, a shooter, an owner, if you learn to accept the Kalashnikov for what it is and just love it for that. Because if you try to make it into, if you try to expect it to be an AR-15, you will be disappointed, because it is not an AR-15. It's an AK. You know, for better or worse, it's not that. So it's up to you if you can live with that. But paying extra money doesn't really get you what you might think it does. Get an AK because you want one, pay what you have to pay, but yeah, don't expect it to be significantly better than it used to be, because it's not going to be. Especially the foreign-made ones. Now the US ones, yeah, they do tend to focus more on cosmetics, which is, I guess, good. The problem is what's underneath. I don't know. I mean, the US-made AKs are kind of their own bag, own game. I personally would rather have a gun with some cosmetic eccentricities, a little character, you know, a weird rivet here, a wiggly mag there, but a gun that I know will run reliably and is built well. I'd rather have that over a picture-perfect gun that looks great, perfect rivets, smooth, even finish, perfectly 12 o'clock sights, but that you can't really know how it's going to hold up in 10 years, 5 years, or even 1 year. Because to me, that's what makes an AK, is that utter reliability, dependability. You take that away, or even you put that into question, what's it got going for it at that point, frankly? And the truth of the matter is, even though some people don't want to admit it, the AR-15 is actually very reliable and very, very, durable today. They have really made a lot of progress with AR-15s over the last 20 years, frankly. So at that, I have to wonder why some people get into the AK. It's not a judgment. There are guns that I don't personally like, but I'm finding that other people do. You know, different strokes type thing. I think some people just have unrealistic expectations, and like I said, they kind of really want the AK to be an AR in terms of fit, finish, and all that quality. Also optics, mounting, and all that. If you want that, there's other things out there, guys. An AK is kind of meant to be a rough and ready, and some might even say ugly and clunky rifle. But for people like me, for us, that's part of its beauty, that's part of its charm, as messed up as that might sound. But I think people, when they buy a gun, realistic expectations are very important. So I just thought it would be kind of interesting to do a video on that subject matter. So what do you think? Have you bought one, and if so, were you pleased or disappointed, and if so or not, which one? And let me know what you think in the comments there. We can have a discussion politely. And again, I'm not railing on any one person. I'm just kind of a thing I'm meant to be commenting on here recently. So let me know. With that, I appreciate you listening to me incoherently ramble. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.